The tea in the bone china cup was cold. It had been cold for 3 days, a stagnant pool of dark amber liquid that had begun to evaporate, leaving a sticky, sugary ring around the inside of the porcelain. But the guest sitting across the table didn't complain. He never complained. He simply stared forward with glassy, unblinking eyes, his smile fixed in a permanent, slightly lopsided grin that didn't quite reach his gaze. "Sit up straight, Mr. Abernathy," the woman said softly. Her voice was like crushed velvet, smooth, expensive, and suffocating. She walked around the heavy oak dining table, the heels of her shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete floor of the basement. The room was windowless, illuminated only by the warm, flickering glow of a dozen beeswax candles and a single Tiffany lamp suspended from the low ceiling. The air smelled of lavender potpourri, damp earth, and beneath it all the sharp chemical sting of formaldehyde. Cordelia Cora Vane stopped behind Mr. Abernathy's chair. She was a striking woman, 32 years old, with jet black hair pulled back into a severe chignon that emphasized her high cheekbones and pale, almost translucent skin. She wore a pristine emerald green dress, cinched at the waist, the kind one might wear to Sunday service, not to a damp basement in the deep woods of Oregon. She placed her hands on Mr. Abernathy's shoulders. Under the expensive wool of his suit, which was 2 sizes too big for his shrunken frame, the flesh felt hard, like cured leather. "You're slouching again," she whispered, her tone disappointed. "It's terribly rude to slouch at dinner." With a sudden, forceful jerk, she pulled his torso back against the chair. The neck made a dry, cracking sound, like a branch snapping in a winter frost. Mr. Abernathy's head lolled to the side, his glass eye catching the candlelight. A thin line of dark fluid leaked from the corner of his mouth, ruining the layer of peach-colored makeup she had applied just that morning. Cordelia sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Silas!" The heavy metal door at the far end of the basement creaked open. A giant of a man stepped into the light. Silas Grimm had to duck his head to enter. He was a mountain of muscle and awkward angles, with hands the size of shovels, and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite by an unsteady hand. He wore a rubber apron over his work clothes stained with fluids that were better left unidentified. "Yes, Miss Cora?" His voice was a deep rumble, barely more than a growl, but filled with a pathetic, puppy-like devotion. "Look at him," Cordelia gestured to Mr. Abernathy with a manicured hand. "He's weeping again. The preservation is failing, Silas. You promised me the mixture was stable." Silas shuffled his feet, looking down at the concrete. He was 38, but in her presence he acted like a scolded schoolboy. "It's the humidity, Miss Cora. The rain. It's been raining for weeks. The damp gets into the bones. And Mr. Abernathy, he was old. His skin doesn't hold the stitch." "Excuses!" she snapped, grabbing a linen napkin to dab at the dead man's chin. "I don't want excuses, Silas. I want perfection. I want silence. I want beauty that lasts." She looked around the table. There were 3 other chairs. 2 were empty. The third was occupied by a woman in a faded floral dress, her head bowed as if in prayer. She had been finished 2 months ago. Her skin had turned a grayish green, and the smell coming from her was becoming difficult to mask with lavender. Cordelia threw the napkin onto the table. "They are ruining the aesthetic. It's all falling apart. The chaos of the world is creeping in here, Silas, right into our sanctuary." Silas took a step forward, reaching out a massive, calloused hand as if to touch her shoulder, but stopped inches away, afraid to soil her dress. "I can fix him, Miss Cora. I can pump more fluid. I can use the wire to hold his head." "No," she said sharply, turning to face him. Her dark eyes flashed with a cold fire. "Mr. Abernathy is spoiled, and Mrs. Higgins," she gestured to the woman in the floral dress, "is past her prime. We cannot build a perfect family with rotten timber." She walked over to a vintage record player in the corner and lifted the needle. The soft scratching sound stopped, and the silence of the basement became absolute, heavy, and oppressive. "It's time to start over, Silas. We need fresh clay. Silas's eyes widened slightly. A mix of fear and excitement washed over his rough features. Tonight? Tonight, she confirmed. The fog is thick. The highway will be quiet. I want someone durable this time. Someone young. Someone with beautiful hands. She looked at her own hands, flexing her long fingers. Mr. Abernathy had such workman's hands. Crude. I want an artist, Silas, or a dreamer. Someone who will appreciate the peace we give them. Silas nodded vigorously. I'll get the truck. I'll bring the kit. And Silas? Yes, Miss Cora? Wear your Sunday suit. We are not butchers. We are collectors. 30 minutes later, a dark 1955 Ford F-100 pickup truck rumbled down the gravel driveway of the Vane farmhouse. The house itself was a Victorian relic, its paint peeling like dead skin, looming silently against the backdrop of the dense towering pines of Hazelwood. The rain had turned the world into a blur of gray and black. The wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield, thwack hiss, a metronome for the hunt. Silas drove with both hands gripping the wheel tight, his knuckles white. Beside him, Cordelia sat perfectly still, staring out into the darkness. She wore a heavy trench coat over her dress and a silk scarf covering her hair. In her lap, she held a small leather doctor's bag. Inside, nestled in velvet, were syringes filled with a cocktail Silas had stolen from the mortuary where he worked, a blend of paralytic agents and a high-concentration sedative. Hazelwood was a town that was slowly dying. The timber mills were closing one by one, and the interstate highway had bypassed the town 5 years ago, siphoning off the lifeblood of commerce. Now it was a place of ghosts and shadows, where transients and drifters often passed through, looking for work that didn't exist. "Where are we going?" Silas asked, his voice low over the hum of the engine and the static of the radio. "Route 9, Cordelia answered, her eyes scanning the wet asphalt illuminated by their yellow headlights. "Near the diner. The bus from Portland dropped off passengers an hour ago. There's always someone left behind." They drove in silence for another 10 minutes. The headlights cut through the fog, revealing flashes of wet pine trees and rusted mailboxes. Then they saw him. He was walking on the shoulder of the road, thumb out, a guitar case slung over his back. He looked miserable, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead. He was young, perhaps early 20s, with a lean, jagged frame. "There," Cordelia whispered, a hungry tightness in her voice. "Slow down. Don't frighten him." Silas eased off the gas. The truck rolled to a crawl next to the walker. The young man looked up, shielding his eyes from the glare. He saw a sturdy truck, a big man behind the wheel and a woman in the passenger seat. A couple, safe. Silas rolled down the window. The cold, wet air rushed into the cab. "Need a lift, son?" Silas asked. He had practiced this line. He tried to sound like a father, like a neighbor. The young man shivered, flashing a grateful, crooked smile. "Yes, sir. God, yes. I've been walking for miles, just trying to get to the motel in town." Cordelia leaned across Silas, offering a warm, motherly smile that didn't reach her predator's eyes. "You'll catch your death out there, dear. Hop in the back or squeeze in here if you don't mind the heat." "I don't mind at all, ma'am. Thank you." The young man opened the door and climbed in, pushing his guitar case between his knees. The cab smelled of old leather, rain, and a faint trace of lavender. "I'm Julian," he said, extending a hand. His fingers were long, slender, and calloused at the tips, musicians' hands. Cordelia stared at those hands for a second too long before taking one in her own. Her skin was ice cold. "I'm Cordelia," she purred. "And this is Silas. We were just heading home for dinner. You look like you haven't eaten in days, Julian." "Not since yesterday morning," Julian admitted, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Well," Cordelia said, glancing at Silas, a silent command passing between them. "We can't have that. We have plenty of room at our table. It would be a shame to eat alone." Silas put the truck in gear. A real shame. he echoed, his voice heavy with dark promise. As the truck accelerated back into the rainy night, Julian relaxed into the seat, thinking his luck had finally turned. He didn't notice that there were no interior door handles on the passenger side. He didn't know that the dinner waiting for him was cold, and the guests were waiting for a new friend to join their eternal silence. The Ford F-100 disappeared around the bend, swallowed by the Oregon mist, carrying the fresh clay for the sculptors of silence. The kitchen of the Vane farmhouse was deceptively warm. A cast-iron wood stove crackled in the corner, casting a flickering orange light against the peeling floral wallpaper. The room smelled of beef stew, rosemary, and the damp wool of drying coats. To Julian, shivering and soaked, it felt like heaven. He sat at the small wooden table, devouring a bowl of stew with a fervor that betrayed his hunger. His guitar case leaned against the wall near the door, a silent witness to his salvation. "Slow down, dear," Cordelia said, her voice soft and maternal. She stood by the stove stirring a kettle. "You'll get a stomachache." "Sorry, ma'am," Julian mumbled between mouthfuls, wiping gravy from his chin with the back of his hand. "Best thing I've tasted in weeks. Real food, not diner grease." Silas sat in the corner, occupying a chair that creaked dangerously under his weight. He wasn't eating, he was watching. His dark, deep-set eyes followed every movement Julian made, the way he lifted the spoon, the way his throat moved when he swallowed, the way his long pianist fingers gripped the edge of the table. It was the look of a butcher assessing the marbling of a prize steer. "You play?" Cordelia asked, nodding toward the guitar case. She poured 3 cups of coffee. 2 were steaming, 1 was slightly cooler, pre-mixed. "A little," Julian smiled, leaning back satiated. "Folk, mostly, some blues. Trying to head down to California. Heard the scene is better there. Oregon is just rain and trees." "Trees have deep roots," Cordelia said, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "They stay where they are planted. There is dignity in that." Julian laughed nervously, sensing a strange shift in the air, but he dismissed it. These were just eccentric country folk. "I guess so. I just want to leave a mark, you know? Make something beautiful before I go." Cordelia's eyes lit up, a genuine, terrifying spark. "Oh, Julian, we understand that desire perfectly, to create something that lasts forever, something that defies the rot of time." She took a sip of her coffee. Silas remained motionless, his cup untouched. Julian lifted his mug. "To leaving a mark," he toasted and drank. The coffee was bitter, masking the metallic tang of the chloral hydrate and paralytic agent Silas had carefully measured out in the pantry. "So," Julian began, setting the cup down, "do you folks have children? This is a big house for 2. "We are building a family," Silas said. It was the first time he had spoken since they entered the house. His voice was gravel grinding on glass. "That's nice," Julian said. He felt a sudden wave of heaviness wash over him. His eyelids felt like they were made of lead. Whoa. "Tired?" Cordelia asked. She moved closer, standing right behind his chair. "Yeah, suddenly, really dizzy," Julian slurred. He tried to push himself up from the table, but his arms didn't cooperate. His beautiful hands, the ones Cordelia admired so much, trembled and collapsed onto the tabletop. The ceramic mug tipped over, spilling dark liquid onto the oilcloth. "It's okay," Cordelia whispered, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "Don't fight it. The world is so loud, Julian, so chaotic. You don't have to run anymore." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, but his muscles were turning to water. He tried to turn his head to look at her, but his neck was stiff, his vision blurred, the edges of the room turning into a vignetted gray tunnel. "What did you—" he gasped, his tongue feeling too thick for his mouth. "We are giving you a gift," Cordelia said, leaning down so her lips brushed his ear. She smelled of lavender and something sharp like alcohol. "We are going to make you perfect, You wanted to be beautiful. You wanted to last. We can do that for you." Julian tried to scream, but only a dry wheeze escaped his throat. The paralysis was setting in fast, seizing his diaphragm. Terror, cold and absolute, flooded his mind, but his body was a stone. Silas stood up. He moved with surprising grace for a man of his size. He walked to the table and easily lifted Julian's limp body, throwing the young man over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "Careful with him," Cordelia instructed, her voice losing its warmth, returning to the clinical tone of the artist. "Mind the head and the hands, Silas. Do not bruise the hands." "Yes, Miss Cora." They moved through the kitchen, through a narrow hallway that smelled of mildew, and down the wooden steps into the basement. The transition was jarring. The warmth of the wood stove was replaced by the damp chill of the earth. The smell of stew was replaced by the stinging scent of formaldehyde. Silas laid Julian down on a large metal table in the center of the room, pushing aside tools that gleamed under the Tiffany lamp, scalpels, trocars, needles, and spools of wire. Julian was still conscious. He could see, he could hear, he could feel the cold metal against his back. He saw the other guests at the dinner table in the shadows, Mr. Abernathy with his lopsided grin, the graying woman in the floral dress. He realized with a silent scream that they weren't sleeping. They were dead, stuffed. Cordelia approached the table. She had removed her apron and was pulling on a pair of thin latex gloves. She looked down at Julian with an expression of pure adoration. "Don't be afraid," she soothed, stroking his forehead. "Pain is temporary, art is eternal. You are going to be the musician. We needed a musician." She turned to Silas. "Strip him, carefully, then prep the femoral artery. We need to drain him while the heart is still beating. It distributes the fluid better." Silas nodded and reached for a pair of shears to cut Julian's wet clothes. Snip, snip. The sound was deafening in the quiet basement. Julian wanted to beg, to cry, to bargain, but he was locked inside his own flesh. He stared up at the Tiffany lamp, at the colorful stained glass, dragonflies and lilies. It was the last beautiful thing he would ever see as a living man. "The mixture is ready," Silas said, holding up a glass jar connected to a rubber tube and a long hollow needle. The fluid inside was pinkish clear. "Proceed," Cordelia commanded. She picked up a sketch pad from a side table. "I want him seated," she murmured, sketching rapidly. Head tilted slightly back, eyes open, looking towards the light. Left hand on the fretboard, right hand poised to strum, an eternal song. Silas found the artery in Julian's thigh. The pinch of the needle was sharp, but distant, like it was happening to someone else. "Sleep now, little bird," Cordelia whispered. As the fluid entered his veins, replacing the warm blood of life with the cold preservative of death, Julian's vision began to fade. The dragonflies on the lamp dissolved into light. The fear finally receded, replaced by a cold, encroaching darkness. The last thing he heard was Cordelia's voice, critiquing the angle of his chin. "Chin up, Silas. We need to wire the jaw before rigor sets in. The first stitch must be perfect." Winter in Hazelwood was relentless. It wasn't the picturesque snow of Christmas cards. It was a season of gray slush, freezing rain, and a damp cold that settled deep in the lungs. For months, the Vane farmhouse had been wrapped in this shroud, isolated from the prying eyes of the town. In the basement, time moved differently. Cordelia stood before Julian. It had been 4 months since the young musician had played his last silent chord. He was seated at the head of the table now, his guitar strap over his shoulder, his fingers permanently curled around the neck of the instrument. From the doorway, he looked alive. A young man paused in mid-song, but Cordelia was not looking from the doorway. She was inches away, holding a magnifying glass. "He's graying, Silas," she murmured, her voice tight with suppressed anger. She touched Julian's cheek. The skin, once pliable and treated with lanolin, was turning the color of old parchment. Worse, there was a faint sunken patch near his temple where the tissue had begun to collapse. Silas was at his workbench grinding a mixture of zinc chloride and alcohol with a mortar and pestle. The sound was a rhythmic cranch, cranch, cranch. "It's the humidity, Miss Cora," Silas repeated his mantra, though he knew it was insufficient. And the fat content. He was too lean. The fluid evaporated too quickly. "He looks like a corpse," Cordelia hissed, turning on him. "I don't want corpses, Silas. The cemetery is full of corpses. I want life suspended. I want the blush of health." She picked up a pot of rouge and a brush, aggressively dabbing color onto Julian's sunken cheeks. It looked garish, like a clown's makeup on a mannequin. She threw the brush against the wall in frustration. "We need to do better. The family is growing, and I won't have them looking like a sideshow attraction." The family had indeed grown. Across from Julian sat Miss Clara Gable. She had been a retired schoolteacher, a lonely woman of 60 with no living relatives, and a cat that had run away. Cordelia had met her at the fabric store in town. Miss Gable had complimented Cordelia's embroidery. 2 weeks later, Miss Gable had been invited for tea to discuss a commission. She never left. Miss Gable was positioned with a book in her lap, a Bible, her head tilted down as if reading a favorite verse. She had been easier to preserve. Her older, drier skin took the tanning agents better than Julian's youth, but she smelled. A faint, sweet, sickly odor of decay that no amount of lavender potpourri could fully mask. And then there was Mr. Renfrew. Mr. Renfrew had been a mistake, or perhaps a necessity of opportunity. He was a traveling salesman selling the Encyclopedia of Human Knowledge. He had knocked on their door 3 weeks ago, pushy and loud, with a cheap suit and a sweating forehead. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He had forced his way into the foyer talking about investing in the future. Silas had snapped his neck before he could finish his pitch about Volume 4. Now Mr. Renfrew stood, not sat, in the corner, posed as if he were mid-speech, one hand raised in the air. Cordelia hated him. She found him vulgar, but Silas had insisted. He needed to practice a new arterial injection technique, one that used a higher concentration of arsenic. "The arsenic is working on the salesman," Silas ventured, gesturing to the corner. "Look, no discoloration, no smell." Cordelia glanced at Mr. Renfrew with disdain. "He's still ugly, but you're right, the skin is firm." She sighed, smoothing her skirt. "Very well, use the arsenic mixture for the next one, but we need someone worthy of the table. No more salesmen, no more lonely spinsters. We need youth, Silas, but youth that lasts." Upstairs, the routine continued. They were careful, paranoid even. Silas went to work at the funeral home every day. He was a model employee, quiet, strong, willing to do the night shifts and the unpleasant removals that the other staff avoided. This gave him unrestricted access to the supply closet. Formaldehyde, methanol, glutaraldehyde, cavity fluid, waxes, cosmetics. He brought them home in his lunch pail, bottle by bottle. Cordelia played her part too. She attended church every other Sunday, just enough to be seen but not enough to be engaged in conversation. She wore high collars and long sleeves. She smiled at the grocer. She paid her bills in cash. The town of Hazelwood was their accomplice, though it didn't know it. In the sheriff's office, a stack of papers sat on the edge of a dusty filing cabinet. They were missing persons reports. Julian Mars, drifter, last seen hitchhiking. Clara Gable, retired. Neighbors assume she moved to her sister's in Idaho. Arthur Renfrew, salesman. Company reported him AWOL with the inventory. Sheriff Miller, a man whose primary interests were fishing and waiting for his pension, glanced at the stack and shrugged. "People leave," Miller told his deputy, a young man named Perkins, who was too eager for his own good. "Look at this town, Perkins. The mill laid off 50 guys last month. The rain never stops. People pack up and go. They don't want to be found. If there's no body, there's no crime. Just folks moving on." "But Miss Gable left her furniture," Perkins noted, frowning. "Old ladies get senile. Probably forgot she owned it. Leave it be, kid. Don't go making work for us." So the files gathered dust. and the Vane farmhouse remained a black hole on the map. Back at the farm, spring was trying to break through the frost. The ground was thawing, turning into a thick, sucking mud. Silas was in the barn, modifying the truck. He was installing a hidden compartment under the bed of the pickup, a sliding tray large enough to hold a human body comfortably. He was welding the metal with intense focus, sparks flying around him like fireflies. Cordelia came out to the porch, holding a cup of tea. She watched him work. She felt a surge of twisted affection for him. He was a brute, yes, but he was her brute. He was the hands that built her vision. "Silas!" she called out. He stopped, lifting his welding mask. His face was smeared with soot. "Yes, Miss Cora?" "The collection needs a centerpiece," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "Julian is fading. Miss Gable is boring. We need something pure, something that screams innocence. Only innocence preserved is truly beautiful." Silas wiped his brow. "Who?" "I saw her today," Cordelia said, her eyes gleaming. "At the market. She was buying apples, golden hair, a blue ribbon. She looked like a porcelain doll come to life." Silas stiffened. "A child?" "No," Cordelia shook her head. "Not a child. A young woman. But she has that light. The pastor's daughter, Mary Beth." Silas dropped his wrench. It clanged loudly against the concrete floor. "The pastor's daughter? Miss Cora, that's dangerous. Everyone knows her. If she goes missing, the town won't just shrug. They'll look." Cordelia walked down the steps, her boots sinking into the mud. She approached Silas and placed a hand on his massive, soot-stained chest. "Let them look," she whispered, a dangerous smile playing on her lips. "We are better than them, Silas. We are artists, and great art requires risk. Imagine her, Silas, sitting at the head of the table, eternal, perfect. She will never grow old. She will never become like those bitter women in town. We will save her." Silas looked into her eyes, and as always, his resistance crumbled. He saw the madness there, but he also saw the passion he worshipped. "When?" he asked. "Sunday," she said. "After the evening service. She walks home alone through the woods. It's a shortcut." "I'll need more fluid," Silas murmured, his mind already calculating the chemistry. "And the wire. I'll need the heavy-gauge wire for the spine." "Get it," Cordelia commanded. "Make her perfect, Silas, or don't come back upstairs." As night fell over Hazelwood, the lights in the Vane farmhouse flickered. In the basement, the guests sat in the dark, waiting for the guest of honor who was still breathing, still laughing, unaware that her seat at the table had already been set. Sunday evening in Hazelwood smelled of wet asphalt and old hymns. The First Baptist Church, a white clapboard structure with a modest steeple, glowed like a lighthouse in the relentless Oregon drizzle. Inside, the congregation was finishing the final verse of "Abide with Me." Outside, parked in the shadows of a large oak tree 200 yards down the road, the dark Ford F-100 sat idling. The engine purred with a low, throaty rumble, barely audible over the rain. Silas gripped the steering wheel, his leather gloves creaking. "Too many people, Miss Cora. The service is just letting out. There are cars everywhere." Cordelia sat beside him, applying a fresh coat of lipstick in the rearview mirror. Her hand was steady. "Patience, Silas. We don't want the flock. We want the lamb that strays." She lowered the mirror and stared through the rain-streaked windshield. Her eyes were predatory, focused on the church doors. "She walks," I checked. "The pastor lives at the parsonage, but Mary Beth visits her grandmother on Sunday nights. She takes the shortcut by the old sawmill road to get back." "The sawmill road," Silas repeated, relaxing slightly. "It's dark there." "Exactly. Dark and quiet. Perfect for a rescue." The church doors opened, spilling golden light and people onto the steps. Umbrellas popped open like black mushrooms. Handshakes were exchanged, cars started up, and slowly the crowd dispersed. Finally, she appeared. Mary Beth Miller was everything Cordelia coveted. 19 years old, with hair the color of spun gold and a face that held a natural, unblemished radiance. She wore a pale blue raincoat and carried a Bible clutched to her chest. She waved goodbye to her father at the door and turned, walking briskly away from the town center, heading toward the darker, tree-lined road that led to the outskirts. "Go," Cordelia whispered. "Give her a head start. We catch her where the streetlights end." Silas put the truck in gear. They rolled forward, headlights off, following the girl like a shark tracking a swimmer in shallow water. Mary Beth hummed to herself as she walked. The rain was cold, but she didn't mind. She liked the smell of the damp pine needles. She was thinking about the sermon, about duty and grace, when she heard the tires crunching on gravel behind her. She didn't panic immediately. It was a public road, after all. She moved to the shoulder, expecting the car to pass, but the vehicle slowed down. She glanced back. A dark, older pickup truck. No lights. A shiver of instinctual fear traced a line down her spine. She picked up her pace, her grip on the Bible tightening. The truck accelerated, matching her speed, then pulled alongside her. The passenger window rolled down. "Evening, miss," a woman's voice. Cultured, polite, not a threat. Mary Beth stopped and turned. The woman in the truck was beautiful, elegant even, despite the gloom. She looked worried. "I'm so sorry to bother you," Cordelia said, leaning out slightly, rain hitting her expensive scarf. "My husband and we seem to be lost. The map is useless in this weather. Could you point us toward the highway?" Mary Beth hesitated. Her father had warned her about strangers, but this wasn't a roughneck or a drunk logger. This was a lady. And the man behind the wheel, though huge, was staring straight ahead, hands at 10 and 2. "The highway is about 3 miles east," Mary Beth said, pointing. "You need to turn around and take the left fork at the bridge." "Oh, thank you," Cordelia beamed. Then her expression shifted to concern. "You're soaked through, dear. Is it far to your house? We'd be happy to drive you. It's the least we can do." "No, thank you," Mary Beth said, taking a step back. The instinct was louder now. Run. "I'm almost there." "Nonsense," Cordelia insisted. Her voice dropped an octave, losing some of its warmth. "Get in the car. It's dangerous out here." "I said no." Mary Beth turned to walk away, fast. "Silas!" Cordelia barked. The mask slipped completely. The driver's side door flew open. Silas moved with terrifying speed for a man of his bulk. He didn't walk, he lunged. Mary Beth screamed, a high piercing sound that cut through the drone of the rain. "Help! Dad!" Silas reached her in 2 strides. His massive hand clamped over her mouth, silencing the scream instantly. He wrapped his other arm around her waist, lifting her off the ground as if she were a doll. She kicked wildly, her heels drumming against his shins, dropping her Bible into the mud. "Get her in! Hurry!" Cordelia hissed, holding the passenger door open. Silas shoved the struggling girl into the cab. Mary Beth bit his hand, tasting leather and sweat. Silas grunted in pain but didn't let go. He punched her, a short, controlled blow to the temple. Mary Beth went limp. Silas shoved her body toward Cordelia, who caught her and pulled her down onto the floorboards, covering her with a blanket. Silas jumped back into the driver's seat, slamming the door. "Drive!" Cordelia screamed. Silas stomped on the gas. The rear tires spun in the mud, screeching for traction before the truck shot forward. But in their haste, they hadn't checked the road behind them. 50 yards back, coming around the bend, was an old tractor. Farmer McGregor was heading home late. His headlights were dim, but they were enough. He saw the dark truck. He saw the struggle. He saw the girl's blue coat disappear into the cab. He didn't see the license plate. It was covered in mud, but he saw the truck, a dark Ford F-100, and he noticed something else. The truck had a custom heavy-duty metal bumper, welded on, unpainted. It glinted silver in his headlights as the truck sped away. McGregor slowed his tractor, staring at the empty spot on the road where the girl had been. He saw a white object lying in the mud. He stopped, climbed down, and picked it up, a leather-bound Bible. On the inside cover, written in neat cursive, Mary Beth Miller. The old farmer's hands began to shake. He looked down the dark road where the red taillights had vanished, then scrambled back onto his tractor. He needed to get to a phone. Inside the truck, the atmosphere was electric with adrenaline. "Did anyone see?" Silas asked, his voice trembling. He was rubbing his bitten hand. "No one," Cordelia lied. She hadn't looked. She was too busy admiring the prize at her feet. She stroked Mary Beth's unconscious head. "Look at her, Silas. She's exquisite. The bone structure, the hair. She will be the angel at the table." "She fought," Silas said, worried. "The others, they didn't fight." "Because she has spirit. That makes the preservation even more valuable, capturing a storm in a bottle." Mary Beth groaned. She was waking up. "She's coming to," Silas warned. Cordelia reached into her bag. She didn't have a syringe ready, but she had a rag soaked in ether. She pressed it firmly over Mary Beth's nose and mouth. The girl thrashed once, weakly, and then went still again. "Drive faster, Silas. We have work to do. Tonight is a special night." They turned off the main road, heading deep into the woods toward the farmhouse. They felt invincible. They felt like gods. They didn't know that back on the sawmill road the police sirens were already beginning to wail. They didn't know that for the first time they had left a witness, and they didn't know that Detective Harlan Reed, hungover and bitter, was about to get the call that would end his career slump and start their nightmare. They carried her into the basement. This time there was no tea, no pretense of a meal. They stripped her of her wet clothes and laid her on the metal table. Cordelia was in a frenzy. She moved around the room, lighting every candle. "The lighting must be perfect. Silas, prepare the mixture. Use the arsenic and the arterial fluid. I want her skin to glow." Silas hesitated. "Miss Cora," my hand. She bit deep. "Ignore it," she snapped. "Pain is irrelevant. Look at her. She is the masterpiece." Silas looked at Mary Beth. She looked like a sleeping princess. For the first time, a seed of doubt sprouted in his simple mind. This wasn't a drifter. This wasn't a nobody. This was the pastor's girl. He remembered her singing in the choir when he was a boy before he stopped going to church. "We should have covered the plates," Silas muttered to himself as he walked to the chemical cabinet. "What did you say?" Cordelia asked sharply. "Nothing, Miss Cora, just measuring." Outside, the rain intensified, washing away the tire. Tracks on the gravel driveway, but it couldn't wash away the mistake they had made on the sawmill road. The clock had started ticking. The morning sun did not rise over Hazelwood. The gray sky simply lightened a few shades, revealing a town gripped by hysteria. The Hazelwood Sheriff's Department was a small brick building that usually smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. Today it smelled of fear and wet wool. The lobby was crowded. Pastor Miller was there, his face pale and drawn, surrounded by weeping parishioners. Deputies were running back and forth, looking busy but achieving little. In the back office, away from the noise, Detective Harlan Reed sat with his feet up on his desk. Reed was 45 but looked 50. He had the face of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and decided to stop being surprised by it. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and an unlit cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth. He wasn't the sheriff. That was Miller, a politician with a badge. But Reed was the one who actually solved things, usually after a pot of coffee and a pack of Lucky Strikes. "Reed!" Sheriff Miller burst into the office, slamming the door behind him to shut out the wailing from the lobby. "Get your feet off the desk. We have a crisis." "I heard," Reed rumbled, his voice like gravel. He didn't move his feet. "Mary Beth Miller, pastor's kid, snatched off Sawmill Road." "It's a kidnapping, Reed, or worse. We have every deputy out beating the bushes. I need you to lead this. The state police are sending guys, but this is our town. We need to find her first." Reed finally dropped his feet to the floor. He picked up a thin file folder from his desk. "I've been reading the witness statement. Farmer McGregor." "Old McGregor is half blind," the sheriff dismissed. "He saw a truck," Reed said, tapping the paper. "Dark pickup, Ford maybe, mid-50s model. But here's the kicker. A custom metal bumper, unpainted, welded. Reed stood up, walking to the wall map of Hazelwood and the surrounding county. He lit a cigarette, ignoring the sheriff's glare. Sawmill Road is a shortcut, Reed muttered, tracing a line with his finger. Locals use it, but it also connects to the old logging routes. Whoever took her knew the roads. This wasn't a drifter passing through on the highway. So it's a local. The sheriff looked sick. Maybe, Reed said. He turned his eyes to a stack of dusty files sitting on top of a filing cabinet in the corner, the dead-end pile. Or maybe it's someone who's been here a while, someone we've been ignoring. Reed spent the next 3 hours doing what he did best, ignoring the noise and looking for patterns. He pulled the files of the missing persons from the last 2 years. Julian Mars, the musician, Clara Gable, the retired teacher, Arthur Renfrew, the encyclopedia salesman. Everyone had written them off. Drifters drift, old ladies move, salesmen skip town with the cash. But Reed laid the reports out on his desk, side by side. Mars disappears in November, Reed whispered to himself. Last seen hitchhiking on Route 9. Renfrew, February, last seen going door to door on the outskirts. Gable, last seen at the fabric store. He looked at the map again. He took a red marker and put an X where each person was last seen. Then he put a circle around Sawmill Road where Mary Beth was taken. They weren't scattered, they were clustered. A 10-mile radius centered around the dense wooded area north of town, an area full of old farms and failing timber lots. And then he found the golden thread. In the file for Clara Gable, there was a small note scribbled by a junior deputy. Neighbor Mrs. Higgins mentioned Clara was excited about a tea invitation from a lovely woman she met at the shop. Didn't catch the name. In the file for Julian Mars, a waitress at the diner had noted, he left with a couple. Big guy, pretty lady, said they were giving him a lift. A couple. Reed sat back, exhaling a plume of smoke. It's not a lone wolf, he said to the empty room. It's a team. He grabbed his coat and his hat. He needed to talk to the mechanics in town. A truck with a custom-welded bumper didn't just appear out of thin air. Someone built it, or someone bought the steel for it. Meanwhile, at the Grimm & Sons funeral home, Silas was trying to keep his hands from shaking as he arranged lilies for a viewing. The town was buzzing. Every person who walked into the funeral home was talking about Mary Beth. They say she was taken right off the road. They say the police are checking every house. They say the FBI is coming. Silas felt like the walls were closing in. He was a big man, used to being invisible, but now he felt like a neon sign was flashing over his head. He dropped a vase. It shattered loudly on the tiled floor. Silas! The head mortician, Mr. Blackwood, stuck his head out of the office. Clumsy oaf. Clean that up. And you look terrible. Go home early. I don't want you scaring the bereaved. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Silas didn't go straight home. He drove his own car, a battered sedan, and not the truck, around the back roads. He saw them. Roadblocks. 2 deputies were stopping cars on the bridge leading to the North Woods. His heart hammered against his ribs. The truck. The Ford F-100 was parked in the barn, covered with a tarp, but the mud, the tires, the bumper. He raced back to the farmhouse. He burst through the front door, breathless. Cora, Miss Cora! She was in the living room, calmly sewing a tear in a velvet curtain. The contrast between the chaos outside and her domestic tranquility was chilling. Stop shouting, Silas, she said without looking up. It's unseemly. The police, Silas gasped, falling to his knees beside her chair. They are blocking the roads. They are checking cars. Mr. Blackwood said the whole town is looking for her. Cordelia tied off a thread and snipped it with small gold scissors. Let them look. They are looking for a lost girl. They won't find her. She isn't lost. She's found. We have to get rid of her, Silas pleaded, grabbing her hand. His grip was too tight, fueled by panic. We have to burn the body, and the others. If they come here, if they find the basement. Cordelia stood up, slapping him across the face. The sound cracked like a whip. Coward, she hissed, her eyes blazing. Burn her? Burn my masterpiece? You would destroy perfection because you are afraid of a few distinct men in uniforms? She grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her. We do not destroy, we preserve. The truck is in the barn. The basement door is hidden behind the pantry shelves. No one comes out here, Silas. We are invisible. But the bumper, Silas whimpered. I welded the bumper. It's distinct. Cordelia paused. A flicker of calculation crossed her face. Then go to the barn, take the torch, cut it off, bury it in the woods. Do it tonight. She smoothed his hair, her voice turning honey-sweet again. Do not worry, my love. We are smarter than them. Now go fix the truck. I have to go downstairs. Mary Beth is ready for her fitting. I'm going to put her in the white lace dress. She will look like a bride. Silas nodded, tears of fear stinging his eyes. He stood up and went out into the rain. As he fired up the welding torch in the dark barn, the blue flame hissing, he didn't know that Detective Reed was currently standing at the counter of the local hardware store, asking the owner who had bought a large amount of heavy-gauge steel plating 3 months ago. Big fella, the owner was saying, scratching his chin. Works at the funeral home. Quiet type. Grimm, I think his name is. Reed wrote the name down in his notebook. He underlined it twice. The search for Mary Beth Miller had turned the quiet forests of Hazelwood into a chaotic grid of shouting men and barking dogs. It was day 2. The optimism of the volunteers was beginning to curdle into dread. The rain had paused, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating mist that clung to the pine trees like wet cotton. Detective Harlan Reed did not join the line of volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through the brush. That was brute force work. Reed preferred precision. He sat in his unmarked cruiser, parked on a logging road about 2 miles north of the Vane farmhouse. On the passenger seat lay his notebook with the name Silas Grimm underlined and a topographical map of the county. Grimm, Reed muttered, lighting a cigarette. Lives on the old Vane property, works with dead bodies, buys steel plating. It was circumstantial, a hunch. In a court of law, it was nothing, but in Reed's gut, it was a screaming siren. He stepped out of the car. The air here was different. Away from the search party's noise, the woods were silent, save for the dripping of water from the canopy. He decided to walk the perimeter of the Vane property, technically public land that bordered their farm. If Silas Grimm was hiding something, he wouldn't hide it in his front yard. He would hide it where the property line blurred into the wild. Reed buttoned his trench coat and stepped over the rusted barbed wire fence that marked the old boundary. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere was brittle. Silas stood by the window in the kitchen, peering through the cracks in the curtains. He could hear the faint barking of bloodhounds in the distance. The sound made his skin crawl. They are getting closer, Miss Cora, he whispered. His hands were raw from scrubbing. He had spent the entire night cutting the bumper off the truck and burying it deep in the manure pile behind the barn. Cordelia was sitting at the table, calmly polishing silver. She didn't look up. Dogs chase rabbits, Silas. We are not rabbits. We are wolves. Wolves get shot, Silas countered, his voice trembling. It was the first time he had ever spoken back to her with such stark reality. Cordelia stopped polishing. She looked at him, her eyes cold and hard like black marbles. Do not let your fear poison this house. Mary Beth is settling in nicely. The first stage of the preservation is complete. She is beautiful. If you panic, you ruin everything. Go to work, act normal. If you hide, you look guilty. Silas swallowed hard. Yes, Miss Cora. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, but the sound of the dogs echoed again, closer this time. Half a mile away, Detective Reed was deep in the undergrowth. His shoes were caked in mud and his suit was damp, but he didn't care. He had found a trail, not a deer trail, but a path worn down by heavy boots. He followed it. It wound away from the main road, dipping into a ravine that smelled foul. It wasn't the smell of natural rot, it was sharper, chemical, like a hospital that had burned down. At the bottom of the ravine, Reed found it. It was a dumping ground, a patch of earth where the vegetation had died, scorched by toxic runoff. Piles of wet ash suggested fires had been lit here to burn refuse. Reed crouched down, using a stick to poke through the debris. He found glass shards, broken vials. He found rags stained with dark, crusty fluids. And then he saw something that made him recoil. Partially buried in the mud was the carcass of a raccoon, but it wasn't decomposing naturally. It was stiff, its fur matted, its mouth wired shut in a grotesque grin. The skin was leathery, preserved. "Practice," Reed whispered. He was practicing. He continued to sift through the mud, ignoring the nausea rising in his throat. If this was where Grimm dumped his mistakes, maybe he dumped other things too, things that belonged to the people he perfected. He turned over a clump of wet leaves and saw a glint of color. Tortoiseshell. Reed reached down and plucked the object from the muck. It was small, triangular, a guitar pick. He wiped it on his sleeve. It was a high-quality pick, the kind professional musicians used. Stamped on one side in gold foil, faded but legible, was the logo of a music shop in Seattle, Julian Mars, the missing drifter. The file said he was a musician heading to California from Seattle. Reed's heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was it. This was the physical link. A guitar pick belonging to a missing man found in a chemical dump site that smelled of embalming fluid on the edge of the property owned by a mortuary worker. He stood up, pocketing the pick in an evidence bag. He looked up the ravine toward the farmhouse. Through the trees, he could just make out the peaked roof of the Vane house, looking like a jagged tooth against the gray sky. He didn't have enough for a search warrant for the house yet. A judge might argue the dump was on public land, but he had enough to bring Silas Grimm in for questioning. He had enough to squeeze him. Reed scrambled back up the ravine, his breathing heavy. He reached his cruiser and grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Reed." "Go ahead, Reed," the crackly voice of the dispatcher replied. "I need a background check on a Cordelia Vane, associates with Silas Grimm, and get me the sheriff. I'm coming in. I have evidence linking the Mars disappearance to the Grimm property." "Copy that, detective. Sheriff is at the Miller residence." "Tell him to meet me at the funeral home," Reed said, his voice grim. "We're going to have a chat with the undertaker." Back at the funeral home, Silas was trying to look busy. He was arranging chairs in the chapel for a service scheduled for that afternoon. His hands were shaking so badly he kept knocking the hymnals over. The bell above the front door chimed. Silas froze. He looked up to see Mr. Blackwood talking to a tall man in a trench coat, a man with tired eyes and a relentless stare. Detective Reed. Silas felt his bladder loosen. He wanted to run, but his feet felt nailed to the floor. Reed walked past Mr. Blackwood straight down the aisle toward Silas. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't shout. He just walked with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a freight train. "Silas Grimm?" Reed asked, stopping 3 feet away. "Yes?" Silas squeaked. Reed held up the plastic bag containing the guitar pick. "You play the guitar, Silas?" Silas stared at the pick. He recognized it. He had thrown it out with Julian's clothes months ago. He thought he had burned it all. "No, sir," Silas whispered. "Didn't think so," Reed said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "But Julian Mars did, and I found this in your backyard, right next to your little taxidermy experiments." Silas's face went gray. "I think you and I need to take a ride, Silas," Reed said, placing a heavy hand on the big man's shoulder. "We have a lot to talk about, like where Mary Beth Miller is." Silas looked at the door. He looked at Reed. For a second, the brute strength that allowed him to snap necks flared up. He could crush this detective. He could run. But then he thought of Cordelia. If he fought, they would go to the house immediately. If he went quietly, maybe he could stall them. Maybe he could protect her. I don't know what you're talking about," Silas lied, but the fight had already left his eyes. "We'll see," Reed said. "Cuff him." 2 uniformed officers stepped out from behind Reed, clicking the handcuffs onto Silas's massive wrists. As they marched him out of the funeral home, Silas looked up at the sky. It was raining again. He wondered if Cordelia was watching from the window and if she knew that the silence was finally broken. The interrogation room at the Hazelwood precinct was a concrete box with no windows. A single bulb caged in wire buzzed overhead like an angry hornet. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sour reek of Silas Grimm's sweat. Silas sat handcuffed to the metal table. Without Cordelia's presence, he looked smaller, despite his massive frame. He was a puppet with cut strings, slumped and staring at his own hands, hands that had snapped necks and arranged flowers with equal precision. Detective Harlan Reed leaned against the wall, watching him. He hadn't asked a question in 20 minutes. He was letting the silence do the work. "I didn't do nothing," Silas mumbled for the 10th time, his voice cracking. "I found that pic. I collect things. That ain't a crime." Reed pushed off the wall and walked to the table. He slammed a heavy file folder down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Stop lying, Silas. It insults my intelligence." Reed pulled out a chair and sat down, invading Silas's personal space. "We found the dump site. We found the animals. You've been practicing taxidermy in the woods. That's weird, Silas, but you're right. It's not a capital crime." Reed leaned in closer, his eyes boring into Silas's. "But kidnapping Mary Beth Miller? That's the electric chair. And killing Julian Mars? That's the chair twice over." "I don't know no Julian," Silas stammered, sweat dripping from his nose. "We have the guitar pick, Silas. And we have the witness who saw a truck just like yours, with that custom bumper you tried to cut off last night, snatch Mary Beth." Reed paused, letting the information sink in. "You're done. The only question is, are you going down alone?" Silas blinked rapidly. "Alone?" "We know about the woman," Reed lied. He didn't know much, just that Silas lived with a Cora vein. He was fishing. Silas flinched as if struck. She has nothing to do with this." "Doesn't she?" Reed lit a cigarette, blowing smoke towards the ceiling. "Because my deputy is looking into Cordelia Vane right now, and you know what he found. He found out she likes dolls, antique dolls, creepy things." "She restores them," Silas shouted, suddenly defensive. "She fixes them. She makes them beautiful again." Reed caught the word, beautiful. "Is that what you were doing to the raccoon, Silas? Making it beautiful? Is that what you did to Julian? To Mary Beth?" Silas clamped his mouth shut, his eyes darting around the room. He realized he had said too much. Outside the interrogation room, Deputy Perkins was waving through the glass. Reed stood up and exited the room. "What do you have, Perkins?" "It's the financials, Detective," Perkins said, holding a sheaf of papers. "We got a warrant for the funeral home's supplier records. Mr. Blackwood, the owner, he keeps meticulous books." Perkins flipped to a page marked with red ink. "Silas has been ordering chemicals on the side, paying cash. But last month he slipped up. He put an order in for 5 gallons of arterial fluid and 2 pounds of powdered arsenic. He didn't have the cash on hand, so he wrote a personal check." "Let me see," Reed said, snatching the paper. It wasn't Silas's signature on the check. It was elegant, flowing cursive. Cordelia Vane. "She paid for the poison," Reed whispered. "She bought the bullet." "And there's more," Perkins added, handing over another report. "We ran a check on Cordelia Vane. She's not from here. She came from California 3 years ago, changed her name. Her real name is Cordelia Diaz. She was institutionalized in Sacramento in '55, attempted to exhume her dead fiancé because she missed him." Reed felt a chill run down his spine. "She's a necrophiliac." "Not sexual, apparently," Perkins corrected. "Aesthetic. The doctors called it a preservation fixation. She couldn't let go. She wanted to freeze him in time." Reed looked back through the glass at Silas. The pieces slammed together. The dolls, the preservation, the missing people who were all physically distinct, the hands of the musician, the face of the girl. "They aren't just killing them," Reed realized, his voice hollow. "They're collecting them. They're building a wax museum out of real people." Reed walked back into the interrogation room. He didn't sit down. He stood over Silas like the wrath of God. She paid for the arsenic, Silas, Reed said softly. We have the check, signed by Cordelia Vane. Silas's face crumbled. He began to weep, deep heaving sobs that shook his massive shoulders. She didn't mean no harm, Silas blubbered. She just hates the noise. She hates how things rot. She just wanted to save them. Save them? Reed shouted. By killing them. Not killing, Silas roared, slamming his fists on the table, denting the metal. Preserving, making them eternal. We gave them peace. Julian is happy. He plays his guitar forever now. Miss Gable reads her book. They don't hurt anymore. The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. And Mary Beth? Reed asked, his voice deadly quiet. Is she happy too? Silas sniffled, wiping his nose. Not yet. She's still settling. The first stage. She's sleeping. Miss Cora is sewing her dress. Is she alive, Silas? Silas hesitated. The fluid, it takes time to work. She was strong. She might still be breathing. Just a little. Reed didn't wait for another word. He turned and kicked the door open. Perkins, get the SWAT team. Get every available unit. She's still alive. We're hitting the farmhouse. Now. The Hazelwood Sheriff's Department, 5 p.m. The station was a flurry of activity. Shotguns were racked. Vests were strapped on. The state police had arrived, bringing tear gas and heavy manpower. Sheriff Miller was pale. You're sure, Reed? You're sure she's in that house? Silas confessed, Reed said, checking the load in his .38 revolver. They're in the basement. He said they have a collection. God only knows what we're going to find down there. And the girl? He says she's sleeping, Reed said grimly. Which means she's drugged and dying. We have maybe an hour before the poison stops her heart. Reed walked out to his car. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with twilight. He looked at the map one last time. The Vane farmhouse sat at the end of a long, single-lane dirt road. It was a fortress of isolation. Listen up, Reed yelled to the assembled officers. We go in hard and fast. The suspect is a female, Cordelia Vane. Do not underestimate her. She is the mastermind. She is delusional and dangerous. If she has a weapon, do not hesitate. Our priority is the girl. Engines roared to life. Sirens were left off. They needed the element of surprise. A convoy of 10 cars snaked out of the parking lot, heading toward the dark woods. At the farmhouse, Cordelia Vane sat in the basement. She had heard the phone ringing upstairs earlier, but she hadn't answered it. Silas was late. He was never late. She looked at Mary Beth. The girl was strapped to the chair at the head of the table, dressed in a vintage white lace wedding gown. Her head was lolling to the side, her breathing shallow and raspy. The paralytic was wearing off slightly, but the sedative was deep. You look lovely, my dear, Cordelia whispered, adjusting the lace collar. Silas will be so pleased when he sees you finished. She walked over to the record player and put on a waltz. The music swelled, filling the room of the dead. Cordelia began to dance, spinning slowly among her silent guests, the musician, the teacher, the salesman. She was lost in her fantasy, unaware that the real world was hurtling down her driveway at 60 miles an hour. She twirled past the small basement window, high up on the wall. For a split second, a beam of light swept across the glass. Headlights. Cordelia stopped dancing. She smiled. Finally, she said to the corpses, Silas is home. She didn't hear the truck doors slamming. She didn't hear the boots on the porch. She only heard the music and the beautiful, perfect silence of her family. The convoy of police cruisers killed their headlights at the end of the long driveway. The rain had started again, a torrential downpour that drummed against the metal roofs of the cars, masking the sound of 12 armed men moving into position. Detective Harlan Reed stepped out of his car, the mud instantly sucking at his boots. He signaled to the SWAT leader, a grim-faced sergeant named Kowalski. Perimeter first, Reed whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. I don't want anyone slipping out the back. Watch the barn. The officers moved like shadows surrounding the rotting Victorian house. It stood dark and silent. a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple sky. Only a faint flickering light leaked from the cracks in the basement foundation. Reed moved to the front porch, flanked by two deputies with shotguns. He took a deep breath. The air smelled of wet pine and ozone. He checked his watch, 6:15 p.m. Every second counted for the girl. "Breach," Reed commanded. Kowalski kicked the front door. The old wood splintered with a sickening crunch. "Police! Sheriff's Department! Coming in!" The shout shattered the silence of the house. Flashlights cut through the gloom of the foyer, dancing over peeling wallpaper and dusty furniture. "Clear left, clear right." The officers swept the ground floor with military precision. The kitchen was empty. The living room was empty, save for the half-mended curtains and the silver polish left on the table. It was eerily normal, a domestic stillness that felt utterly wrong given the monster who lived here. "Detective," Perkins shouted from the kitchen. "The pantry, just like Silas said." Reed ran to the kitchen. Perkins had pushed aside a heavy shelving unit filled with jars of pickled beets. Behind it was a narrow wooden door secured with a heavy iron latch. A strange smell seeped through the cracks, a cloying chemical sweetness. Lavender and death. And faintly from beneath the floorboards came the sound of music, a scratchy, distorted waltz. Reed unholstered his revolver. "Everyone back. Perkins, get the ram, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Crash." The basement door flew open, banging against the wall. The smell rushed up the stairs, thick enough to make Reed gag. It was the smell of a morgue trying to disguise itself as a flower shop. "Go, go, go!" They descended the wooden stairs, their boots thundering. The stairs were steep, leading down into a pool of warm golden candlelight. What they saw at the bottom stopped them cold. The basement was not a dungeon, it was a dining room. A large oak table dominated the center of the space, set with fine china, silver cutlery, and crystal glasses. Dozens of beeswax candles flickered in candelabras, casting long dancing shadows on the concrete walls, and the guests were seated. To the left sat Julian Mars, the missing musician. He was posed with his guitar, his fingers frozen on the fretboard, his head tilted back as if singing to the ceiling. His skin was waxy, his eyes replaced with glass orbs that stared unseeingly at the intruders. Across from him sat Miss Clara Gable, the teacher. She was stiff, her hands glued to a Bible, a permanent serene smile stitched onto her face. In the corner stood Arthur Renfrew, the salesman, frozen in a mid-gesture wave, like a department store mannequin from hell. The horror of the scene was its stillness. They looked like people, but they had the terrifying, absolute immobility of objects. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski whispered, lowering his shotgun. "Don't look at them," Reed barked, his eyes scanning the room. "Find the girl." At the head of the table, illuminated by the Tiffany lamp, sat Mary Beth Miller. She was dressed in a vintage white lace wedding gown that was slightly too big for her. Her blonde hair was brushed to a shine and adorned with a crown of dried flowers. Her head was slumped forward, her chin resting on her chest. Standing behind her, holding a silver hairbrush, was Cordelia Vane. Cordelia did not look terrified. She looked annoyed. She wore her emerald green dress, her makeup flawless. She looked at the armed men bursting into her sanctuary with the disdain of a queen interrupted by peasants. "You are interrupting the dinner," Cordelia said, her voice calm, cutting through the waltz playing on the turntable. "It is terribly rude to barge in without an invitation." "Cordelia Vane," Reed shouted, leveling his gun at her chest. "Step away from the girl. Put your hands in the air." Cordelia sighed, stroking Mary Beth's hair. "She isn't ready for visitors. She's sleeping. The setting process is delicate. Loud noises can disturb the tissues." "I said step away." Reed took a step forward. "Now." Cordelia's eyes flashed. The calm mask cracked, revealing the jagged madness underneath. She dropped the hairbrush and reached into the pocket of her dress. "Gun!" Perkins shouted. But it wasn't a gun, it was a scalpel. The blade caught, the candlelight gleaming wicked and sharp. In one fluid motion, Cordelia grabbed Mary Beth by the hair, yanking her head back. She pressed the scalpel to the girl's exposed, pale throat. "Get out!" Cordelia screamed, her voice distorting into a shriek. "Get out of my house! You will not ruin this! You will not take her back to the ugly world! She is mine! She is perfect!" The police froze. A shot was risky. If Cordelia flinched, the blade would sever the jugular. "Cordelia," Reed said, lowering his voice but keeping his aim steady. "Look at her. She's cold. She needs a doctor." "She needs eternity," Cordelia spat. "Silas understands. Where is Silas? Did you hurt him, you brutes?" "Silas sent us," Reed lied, taking a slow step closer. "He wants you to finish the work, but you need the right tools. You can't do it with a scalpel. You need the fluid." Cordelia hesitated. Her eyes darted to the chemical table in the corner. For a fraction of a second, the artist in her warred with the killer. "The fluid," she muttered. "Yes, the mixture needs to be topped off." That split second was all Reed needed. He didn't shoot. He lunged. Reed covered the 10 feet between them in a desperate tackle. He hit Cordelia with the full weight of his body, knocking her away from Mary Beth. They crashed into the concrete floor, sending a chair clattering. Cordelia fought with the strength of the possessed. She slashed wildly with the scalpel, slicing through the sleeve of Reed's trench coat and biting into his forearm. "Get off me, filthy animal!" she shrieked, clawing at his face. "Secure her!" Reed grunted, pinning her wrist to the floor and knocking the scalpel away. Kowalski and Perkins swarmed in. It took 3 men to subdue her. They forced her arms behind her back, the handcuffs clicking shut with a sound of finality. Cordelia screamed, a long, agonizing wail of despair. Not because she was caught, but because her art was being touched. "Don't touch them! You'll ruin the pose! You're breaking the composition!" Reed ignored her, scrambling to his knees and turning to Mary Beth. The girl was unnaturally still. Her skin was cold and clammy, pale with a bluish tint around the lips. Reed placed 2 fingers against her neck. Silence. Then a flutter. Weak. Thready. But there. "She's alive!" Reed yelled, his voice cracking. "Medic, get the medic down here, now!" 2 paramedics rushed down the stairs carrying a trauma kit. They pushed Reed aside, cutting the lace dress to attach sensors, injecting a stimulant into her arm. "Heart rate is thready, respiration is depressed. It looks like opioid overdose mixed with something else," the medic shouted. "We need to bag her. Move." They lifted Mary Beth onto a stretcher. As they carried her past the guests, her hand flopped down, brushing against the stiff-suited arm of Julian Mars, a living girl brushing against the dead boy she had replaced. Cordelia was being dragged up the stairs, still screaming. "She was almost perfect! Silas! Why did you let them in? Silas!" Reed stood in the center of the basement, clutching his bleeding arm. The waltz finally ended, the needle scratching rhythmically in the run-out groove. Click hiss, click hiss. He looked around the room. The candlelight flickered on the faces of the dead, the teacher, the salesman, the drifter. They sat in judgment, their glass eyes reflecting the chaos. Reed reached out and lifted the needle from the record player. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. "Get the photographers," Reed said to a pale-faced deputy. "And call the coroner. We're going to need a lot of body bags." He walked over to the table and picked up the hairbrush Cordelia had dropped. A single strand of golden hair was caught in the bristles. It was over. The sculptors of silence were finished. But looking at the frozen smiles of the victims, Reed knew that the nightmares were just beginning. The Hazelwood County Courthouse was built in 1920 to handle land disputes and petty thefts. It was never designed to hold the devil. 6 months had passed since the raid. The summer heat had settled over Oregon, heavy and suffocating. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago. The ceiling fan spun lazily, doing nothing to cut through the thick air of sweat, tobacco smoke, and anticipation. The Dollmaker trial, the papers called it. The Tea Party murders. Detective Harlan Reed sat in the front row, his arm healed but stiff. He watched the defendant's table. Silas Grimm sat on the left. He had lost 50 pounds in county jail. His suit hung off his massive frame like loose skin. He kept his head down, staring at his hands, weeping silently whenever the prosecutor raised his voice. He looked pathetic. A mountain crumbled into gravel. Cordelia Vane sat on the right. She was the center of gravity. She wore a black dress, high-necked and severe. Her hair was pulled back, her face devoid of makeup, revealing the sharp bird-like angles of her skull. She did not look at the judge. She did not look at the jury. She looked at the sketch artists in the press box, critiquing their work with a slight disdainful curl of her lip. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a widow at a funeral for someone she didn't particularly like. The state calls Mary Beth Miller. A hush fell over the room. It was absolute. The silence that Cordelia loved so much finally filled the court, but it was thick with horror, not peace. The side door opened. Mary Beth walked in. She used a cane. The nerve damage from the paralytics had left her with a slight limp in her left leg. She was pale, her golden hair cut short, utilitarian. The angel Cordelia had tried to create was gone. In her place was a survivor made of scar tissue and steel. She took the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, the same book Silas had ripped from her hands on the Sawmill Road. District Attorney Ford, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, approached the stand gently. "Miss Miller," he began softly, "can you tell the jury what you remember from the night of the raid?" Mary Beth gripped the railing of the witness box. Her knuckles were white. She didn't look at Silas, but she turned her head and looked straight at Cordelia. "I remember the cold," Mary Beth said, her voice steady but hollow. "I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. I could hear the rain outside. I could hear the needle on the record player, and I could hear her." "Cordelia Vane?" Ford asked. "Yes, she was brushing my hair. She told me I was almost dry. She said I was going to be the centerpiece." Mary Beth paused, taking a shaky breath. "She didn't look at me like a person. She looked at me like clay. She talked about my skin, my eyes, my hands, but she never asked if I was hurting. She didn't care that I was screaming inside my own head." Cordelia leaned forward at the defense table. She wasn't angry. She looked puzzled. She whispered something to her court-appointed lawyer, who turned pale and shushed her. "What did she whisper?" the judge asked sharply. "Counselor." The lawyer stood up, sweating. "Your Honor, my client, she asks why the witness is moving so much. She says it ruins the aesthetic." A gasp went through the courtroom. A woman in the back row started sobbing. The jury, 12 men and women from Hazelwood, stared at Cordelia with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Cordelia simply adjusted her cuffs, unbothered. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The evidence was insurmountable. Detective Reed took the stand and walked the jury through the photos of the basement. The photos were black and white, but the horror needed no color. The guests at the table, the jars of organs, the chemical receipts signed by Cordelia. Silas testified on the 8th day. It was part of a plea deal to avoid the electric chair. "She told me they were lonely," Silas croaked into the microphone. "She said the world was ugly and rotting. She said we were saving them. I loved her. I just wanted to make her happy." "Did you kill Julian Mars?" the DA asked. "Yes." "Did you kill Clara Gable?" "Yes." "Did you kill Arthur Renfrew?" "Yes." "Why, Silas?" Silas looked at Cordelia. For the first time, she looked back at him. Her eyes were empty voids. There was no affection, no recognition. He was just a broken tool. "Because," Silas whispered, "she said if I didn't, she would leave me. And I didn't want to be alone in the dark." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a local mechanic, refused to look at the defendants. "We find the defendant, Silas Grimm, guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping." Silas closed his eyes and nodded, accepting his fate. We find the defendant, Cordelia Vane, guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping. Silas closed his eyes and nodded, accepting his fate. We find the defendant, Cordelia Vane, guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge, a stern man named Reynolds, looked over his glasses at Cordelia. Cordelia Vane, you have shown no remorse. You have turned this courtroom into a theater for your vanity. You speak of art and beauty, but all I see is butchery. Cordelia stood up. The bailiffs tensed. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and melodic, carrying to the back of the room. You misunderstand. Butchery is messy. Butchery is temporary. What I created was eternal. You are all rotting. Every second your cells are dying. You are decaying right now. I simply stopped the clock. I am not a killer. I am a preservationist. Sit down. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. You can lock me away, Cordelia continued, a beatific smile spreading across her face. But you cannot unmake them. You cannot erase the perfection I achieved. I win. The sentence, Silas Grimm was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spared him the death penalty only because of his diminished mental capacity and cooperation. He would die in a concrete box, just as he feared. Cordelia Vane was declared criminally insane but fit for punishment. She was sentenced to indefinite confinement at the state hospital for the criminally insane in the maximum security wing. As the bailiffs led her away, handcuffed and shackled, she didn't look at the weeping families. She didn't look at Reed. She looked past them all, staring at a patch of sunlight on the wall, imagining how she would frame it, how she would capture it, how she would make it stay forever. Detective Reed walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding sunlight. He lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. It's over, Harlan, Sheriff Miller said, clapping him on the back. We got him. Reed looked at the smoke curling from his cigarette. Yeah, he said quietly. We got him. But I don't think she believes she lost. The town had changed. The timber mills were long gone, replaced by strip malls and gas stations. The interstate finally added an exit for Hazelwood, bringing traffic, noise, and neon lights. The isolation that had once suffocated the town was broken by the hum of modernity, but the woods to the north were still dark. The Vane farmhouse was gone. It had burned to the ground in 1974, arson suspected to be the work of local teenagers on Halloween. Now only the stone foundation remained, a jagged scar in the earth swallowed by blackberry bushes and stinging nettles. The locals didn't go there. They said the birds didn't sing in that clearing. The survivor, Mary Beth Miller, sat on her front porch. She was 54 years old now. Her golden hair was gray, pulled back in a loose bun. She rubbed her left knee absent-mindedly. The rain was coming, and the old nerve damage always flared up when the pressure dropped. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mother of 3, a grandmother of 2. She ran the church choir. She filled her life with noise, children laughing, hymns rising to the rafters, the clatter of dinner plates. She never wore white lace, and she never allowed absolute silence in her house. Even at night, a fan hummed or a radio played softly. Silence was the enemy. Silence was the basement. She looked out at the rain. Sometimes in the reflection of the window, she would catch a glimpse of her own neck and check for a scar that wasn't there. Grandma? A little boy tugged at her sleeve. Are you okay? Mary Beth looked down and smiled. It was a warm, living smile. I'm fine, sweetie, just listening to the rain. The detective Harlan Reed lived in a small assisted living facility on the edge of town. He was 80. Emphysema had taken his lungs, a parting gift from 40 years of Lucky Strikes. He moved slowly, tethered to an oxygen tank that hissed rhythmically. Hiss, click, like a record player skipping. He didn't have many visitors. Sheriff Miller had passed away 10 years ago. Perkins had moved to Florida. On his bedside table, there was no photo of a wife or kids. There was just a small framed newspaper clipping from 1965. Dollmaker caught, girl saved. Reed picked up the frame with shaking hands. He looked at the blurry photo of himself, young and angry, leading Cordelia away. He had won the case, but he knew the truth. You never really catch monsters like that. You just put them in a cage while the nightmares roam free. He set the photo down and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still smell the lavender. The artist. The Oregon State Hospital was a fortress of brick and iron. In the geriatric ward of the maximum security wing, patient 4096 sat in a wheelchair by the window. Cordelia Vane was 67. Her hair was thin and white, her skin like crumpled tissue paper. She had not spoken a word since 1980. The doctors called it catatonia. The nurses called it checking out. But Cordelia wasn't checked out. She was focusing. For 15 years, she had been practicing the ultimate discipline. She sat perfectly still. She barely blinked. Her breathing was so shallow it was imperceptible. She looked at her hands. They were spotted with age, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. Decay, she thought. The rot is winning. But she had a plan. It was late afternoon. The sun was setting, casting a long golden rectangle of light onto the linoleum floor. Dust motes danced in the beam. Cordelia felt her heart flutter. It was weak, failing. The final curtain was coming. She didn't panic. She didn't call for the nurse. She summoned every ounce of her remaining will. She straightened her spine. She tilted her chin up, just so, catching the light. She arranged her hands in her lap, palms up, fingers gracefully curled. She composed her face into a mask of serene, eternal beatitude. She was not dying. She was posing. As her heart gave its final stuttering beat, Cordelia Vane did not see darkness. She saw the flash of a camera. She saw the perfect frame. When the nurse came in for the evening rounds an hour later, she gasped. Old Cordelia was dead, but she didn't look dead. She sat rigidly upright, bathed in the last light of the day, a terrifying, triumphant smile frozen on her face. Even in the end, she had turned herself into a statue. The silence had finally claimed its creator.